you? Good morning to everyone. It is good to see everybody today. I thank Andrew Williams for filling in for me. I appreciate Andrew so much. He's growing a lot in regard to his faith and Bible study, and so it's I always enjoy listening to him myself. We want to invite you to turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 12. Deuteronomy chapter 12. We are in a study, actually, of the book of Leviticus. And so you may be wondering, what are we doing in Deuteronomy? Well, we'll find out in just a minute. Um, there's one more lesson. The lesson this morning is actually still an introductory to Leviticus. Next week, we'll actually begin in Leviticus chapter 1. And we'll begin looking at each individual sacrifice. But there are some important points here. I've done the separation of introduction to the actual study of Leviticus. One reason because next Sunday starts a new quarter, and so those who perhaps are teaching now can come into the study itself and not be lost regarding everything that's gone on with that. So I do have a question, though. How many of you use the NIV? Okay. And how many of you use the New American Standard Version? Okay. We're about the same either way. So I was trying to decide which translation to read out of this morning. But it looks like it doesn't make much difference, so I might choose a different one. How's that? I want you to just follow along as we read Deuteronomy chapter 12. And I want to read the entire chapter because I think that it needs to be said in its context. You realize that God is still introducing himself to his people. And so he is making preparation here, allowing them to understand his nature, helping them to understand what he expects or how they are to view him, how they are to serve him. And so this is part of Deuteronomy chapter 12. So follow along. And I'll be reading out not the New American Standard. Okay. These are the statutes and the judgments which you shall carefully observe in the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you to possess as long as you live on the earth. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. And you shall tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and burn their Asherim with fire. And you shall cut down the engraved images of their gods, and you shall obliterate their name from that place. It's a little interesting. I don't know why exactly God made this distinction between the Asherim and the rest of the idols. But the Asherim really is the wooden. It's a female wooden statue of an Egyptian god. So why he makes a distinction, I'm not exactly sure. But he does in this, and you understand that they are to destroy those with fire. Verse 4: You shall not act like this toward the Lord your God, but you shall seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God shall choose from all your tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling, and there you shall come. And there you shall bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the contribution of your hand, your votive offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. There also you and your household shall eat before the Lord your God, and rejoice in all your understanding in which the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall not do at all what we are doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. For you shall not as yet come to the resting place and the inheritance which the Lord your God is giving you. When you cross the Jordan and live in the land which the Lord your God is giving, and he gives you rest from all your enemies around you, so that you live in security, then it shall come about that the place in which the Lord your God shall choose for his name to dwell, there you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, and your contribution of your hand, your choice of votive offerings, which you will vow to the Lord. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levite who is within your gates, since he has no portion or inheritance with you. Be careful that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every cultic place you see, but in the place which the Lord chooses in one of your tribes. There you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you. However, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your gates, whatever you desire, according to the blessing of the Lord your God, which he has given you. The unclean and the clean may eat of it, as of the gazelle and the deer. Only you shall not eat the blood. You are to pour it out on the ground like water. You are not allowed to eat within your gates the tithe of your grain or your new wine or oil or the firstborn of your herd or flock, or any of your votive offerings which you vow, or your free will offerings or the contribution of your hand. But you shall eat them before the Lord your God in the place in which the Lord your God will choose. You and your son and daughter, and your male and female servants, and the Levite who is within your gates, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God in all your undertakings. Be careful that you do not forsake the Levite as long as you live in your land. When the Lord your God extends your border, as he has promised you, and you say, I will eat meat, because you desire to eat meat, then you shall eat meat, whatever you desire. If the place which the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, then you may slaughter of your herd and flock which the Lord has given you. And as I have commanded you, and you may eat within your gates whatever you desire. Just as a gazelle or a deer is eaten, so you shall eat it. The unclean and the clean alike may eat of it. Only be sure, do not eat the blood, for the blood is the life, and you shall not eat the life with the flesh. You shall not eat it. You shall pour it out on the ground like water. You shall not eat it in order that it may be well with you and your sons after you, for you will be doing what is right in the sight of the Lord. Only your holy ones, which you may have, and your votive offerings, you shall take and go to the place which the Lord chooses. And you shall offer your burnt offerings, the flesh and the blood, on the altar of the Lord your God. And the blood of your sacrifices shall be poured out on the altar of the Lord your God, and you shall eat the flesh. Be careful to listen to all these words which I command you, in order that it may be well with you and your sons after you, for you will be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. When the Lord your God cuts off before you the nations which are going in to dispossess, and you dispossess them and dwell in their land, beware that you are not ensnared to follow after them, after they are destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods, that I also may do likewise? You shall not behave like thus toward your Lord your God, for every abominable act which the Lord hates, they have done for their gods. For they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire of their gods. Whatever I command you, you shall be careful to do. You shall not add to or take away from it. Uh, there's a lot of conversation in that chapter about the idea of the contrast between foreign gods and Jehovah God, right? And the concern is that they might develop habits from the foreign gods that actually they would turn around and try to serve Jehovah God in the same way. There's also some other points here that I want to draw out here. Verse 8, you shall not do at all what we are doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. How serious is that? We are responsible for what God has told us, right? And we cannot do or worship God our own way. We must understand that God is to be worshiped the way that He has revealed Himself to us. And so He is teaching that then this lesson, right? Also look at verse 28. And this is actually repeated twice here in this chapter. But he says, be careful to listen to all these words which I command you, in order that it may go well with you and your sons after you, for you will be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. What relationship do the fathers have to the practice of the sons? What relationship do the fathers have or responsibility have toward their sons? Teaching them the right way. And that's not just in words, right? But it's also in practice. It's also in the sons watching them and understanding what they are doing. Okay. Last point I want to draw out here, and then we're going to go to the lesson, is in verse 32. He says, whatever I command you, you shall be careful to do. You shall not add to nor take away from it. We need not be flippant about our obedience and observance and instruction that God has given to us. Right? Not add to, nor take away. Yeah. So as you close out the book of Revelation, you also have this repeated instruction here, not to take away or add to. Okay, I'm going to leave that at that. Although I really want to stress the importance. You know, I'm afraid the religious world is pretty lackadaisical about doing what God commands. We're kind of maybe a little boisterous, maybe in thinking that we can outthink God in what He says and say to ourselves, "Oh, God won't mind. You know, we can do this. I mean, it's not a problem or a difficult thing. You know." And the reality is, God will actually allow that to happen. Romans chapter 1, the first chapter, deals with this idea of kind of this idea of everybody doing what was right in their own eyes. And God gave them over to. You find that phrase several times in Romans chapter 1. God gave them over to their own lusts and passions, right? God gave them over to their own desires. And so God, in his instruction of the 10 words, the 10 commandments, in his instruction of the Levitical system, sacrificial system, he was teaching Israel what was good and right. And one of the reasons for doing that was that it might go well with them, right? What happens if we don't do, what happens if Israel did not do what God instructed? So if you sometime this afternoon, or if you think about it later on the week, if you read Deuteronomy chapters 27 and 28, you understand that there was blessings in following God's instruction. And on the other side, there was a curse if they did not follow his instruction. The sad thing is that the rest of the Old Testament deals with the idea of how obedient or disobedient they were. And the prophets had to bring the message of repentance to them because they fell off the wagon, if that's what we can say. It's important for us to really impress upon each other and encourage each other to be faithful, right? To be faithful to what God has said. Let me deal with this general lesson with the idea of when you get into the book of Leviticus, and you even see it here in Deuteronomy chapter 12, there is importance in each type of sacrifice. There is instruction in each type of sacrifice, and they're not all the same. But they are to teach lessons that God is revealing himself in his holiness. But he's also drawing the Israelite, the believer, into understanding who he is and understanding in a deeper way their relationship to him. So let me speak about the distinctions that are made between the sacrifices a little bit. Each sacrifice was distinct in purpose and ritual. Okay? Therefore, they were not interchangeable. Now, we'll understand that when we get into that a little bit later. But there was a specific purpose that God gave regarding the whole burnt offering, the meal sacrifice, the peace offering. There was a distinct difference in all those instructions that he gave regarding those sacrifices. The sacrificial victims or the animals or the materials often varied in regard to the sacrifices. Certain animals were demanded and required shedding of blood for some measure of atonement. Sometimes the blood becomes very significant in regard to a sacrifice. Other times it's just kind of a marginal thing. But it speaks about the importance of the idea of the animal having to shed its blood. You also understand that vegetables were generally grains or liquids from cultivated sources. It was the first fruit of the crop. I don't know how many farmers or people were raised on the farm. But it was always very significant whenever you pull into, for the first time in a harvest, to pull into a field. And it was significant. I mean, if you're a farmer, to look back into the combine and see that grain rolling out. Um, I may have told you this story. My grandfather and father would save grain from this crop for next year, and usually pulled out the most important part of the field that was fruitful to pull that grain from. And I would, my grandfather bought the old Valley City store or schoolhouse, and I would play in the granary a lot of times. And I'd get in trouble because I soybeans with the corn or the wheat. But those Tonka trucks, just kind of go over the top of that grain, not good, but it looks better if you've mixed the grain, right? That wasn't true. Okay. Um, so it's important to understand that there was instruction regarding the grain that they would use. You'll also find out that in regard to the sacrifices, it was not to be wild grain. It wasn't to be grain that actually came up from last year. Or if you planted milo the year before, a lot of times the grain was small, and oftentimes it would come up in the corn. And so you had to be careful. I mean, you could not offer the wild grain to God. The significance was that it had to be cultivated, and it was cultivated by you. And so it was you who actually were blessed by God regarding this grain, but the first fruits you were to bring to offer to God. Worship sacrifices belong to what we call the sweet savor or the fragrant odor. It was a distinction that is only accepted by a covenant relationship or people who were in relationship with God. So when you look at the worship sacrifices, they include the burnt offering, the meal offering, and the peace offering. And so when you look at the overall broad context of where those were offered, there could be a burnt offering that was offered by the individual, but also there's a burnt offering that's offered regarding the nation. That's also true regarding the meal offering. But the drink offering itself was included in this designation as well, too. The peace offering was both individual and family, but there was no national requirement in regard to the peace offering. I listened to the news a little bit this morning, and they were talking about the Russian-Ukraine thing and China and United States and all those things that were going on with that. And I was thinking about the study that we're going through in this process. It would be nice for us to remember what peace cost, right? What did peace cost God? The life of Christ, right? And every first day of the week, we remember that as we come. But Christ is our hope that exists out of that. Sacrifices of atonement were not sweet savor or fragrant odor. So when we talk about the idea of the burnt offering, meal offering, the first 3 or 4 sacrifices, there's a marginal atonement there. But when you get into the idea of the sin offering or the trespass offering, that was not sweet savor to God. It meant that Israel had violated their relationship. And so the sin offering which is a violation of the first five commandments. The sin offering actually was a violation of God's nature. And through the breaking of any of the first five commandments, that relationship was expressed. And so it demanded a sin offering. Now, the Israelite could not offer a whole burnt offering or a meal offering or a peace offering if he had sinned against God or sinned against his neighbor. He first had to offer the sin offering or the trespass offering. And then he could offer the most important sacrifices. So it speaks about a relationship which is horizontal to our brother or sister, but it also speaks about our relationship to and so the trespass offering was individual only. It's a violation of God's government, and by invading God-given design rights of others, by breaking any of the last 10 commandments. Okay. When we look at the last 5 commandments, do we really see that as a violation of the other person's designed rights or divine rights? I think since we're not bound by the 10 Commandments anymore, we don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to that. But God was teaching His people that He has protection over other people's rights. They are made in God's image. Well, I'm made in God's image. Am I not important? Well, yeah, I'm important. But we need to understand everybody else is important too. So let me just throw in this idea of there should not be difficulty in regard to racism. Every man is made in the image of God. And so we need to understand that, okay? The Day of Atonement sacrifice, Yom Kippur, is it's national in nature, but it also has individual application. Let me take you through a little exercise here for us to think about this just a little bit. So Yom Kippur is a national recognition. It's a Day of Atonement. All of Israel is to come into God's presence, is to recognize who He is. They are to recognize the idea of sacrifice, and it is a collective sacrifice. It is a national sacrifice that's given to that. But it's also individual. Let me draw us to our time now and thinking, because this principle is found both in the Old and New Testaments. When we come to the Lord's table on Sunday morning, we come collectively. We come as one body to recognize that. Are we selfish in mind? Or do we think about the fact that the person who sits beside us is also just as important as I am? That Jesus died for them too. And so we come in a collective nature, but it's also individual. But the thoughts are there. Okay. Let me talk about the animals here that were required for sacrifices. God never accepted any wild beast sacrifice. The sacrifices that were to be offered were first fruits, but they were also to be domesticated. Okay. So when you think about that, the animals of the herd, they were oxen or cattle. Of the flock, there were sheep or goats. Of the fowl, there was pigeons and turtle doves. Okay, but they were all domesticated animals. Now I relate that a little bit, and here's my growing up years in farm things, because I was in 4-H and I raised cattle and all those type of things, and you became your animal became pretty much your pet, right? When I was when I was pretty young, still about 10, 12 years old. Uh, yeah, that's young. Uh, uh, my father brought my uncle's dairy herd over because he had been involved in a tractor accident, and so he brought them over. And one of the things that happened with that, or agreement they had with that, was the fact that uh, the calves that were born while they were with us became ours. And so we had the calves, and so Dad decided, "Oh, I'm just going to give the calves to my children." So my sister Becky and I received the calves, and so children love to name names, right? So you give names to the calves that were there, and my sister, one of the first ones, she just named Mommy. Now, what happens with that and with siblings is, those calves only last so long, and sometimes they go to the butcher shop, and we sit down at the table and we're reminded of that. And I got in trouble big time for teasing my sister that we were eating Mommy, you know. Um, and so they were domesticated animals. I mean, there was a connection. There was a connection that you made, oftentimes with animals that were there. They were to be the first fruits. They were to be the best. Now, does mankind ever have any issues or difficulty with the idea, I think I'll just keep the best and I'll give away something that's a little bit less than that? God didn't accept anything less. He was teaching his people, you give the best. And does God deserve the best? But it's a human mental challenge to think about that. Um, there were qualities that were demanded in regard to the selection of animals. Were already implied. They were to be domesticated. They were to be tame. Not the unknown victim of a chase or a hunt. Not the rogue or the savage. I can tell you lots of stories. My father owned a livestock auction, and I worked in the livestock auction, and sometimes you'd open the tailgate, and the owner would never tell you that thing, you better watch out. You just knew when he came out of the truck or the trailer, he was going to turn, and he was going to take out anything that was in there with him. And so God didn't accept that. He would not accept that. He also would not accept the maverick or the ravenous. No wild creature such as a lion or a vulture would be accepted. And perhaps all of those things are reflective of the idea of the nature of Christ, who was the Lamb of God. Like a lamb that was led to the slaughter, he remained silent. Right? And so there was responsibilities in regard to the selection of animals. It was also to be clean. Therefore, it was to be a plant eater, not carnivorous, not a flesh eater. Okay, and then it was also to be without physical blemish, uh, materially perfect as a symbol of the spiritual perfection of Christ. Leviticus chapter 22, verse 20 says, "Do not bring anything with a defect, because it will not be accepted on your behalf." Now, here's this mental human challenge once again with the idea of, a calf that has a limp, or a calf that has had, or perhaps has been sick some or another. Okay, you're a horse person, right? You could not offer anything but the best to God. And so this reflection of this animal is reflective of the nature of Christ, who was sinless, blameless, pure, right? And so that also had to be reflective of the sacrifice that the Israelite would give. Males were preferred most of the time in regard to the sacrifices. On the occasion of the red heifer sacrifice that the Hebrew writer speaks about, it was obviously female. And it was reflective of fertility in regard to that sacrifice. And we may have time to get into the red heifer sacrifice a little bit later on. We'll just see how much time we have. The vegetables or the herbs or the cereal or the grains or the juices, they were cultivated grains and foodstuffs only. Okay? Not voluntarily growth or wild products that we talked about. They had to be the first fruits of man's cultivation, and they never were offered in the bare form. They were always prepared either by grinding or parching or made into cakes. What do you think the significance of that is? Just think about that for just a little bit. What's the significance of the idea that the cakes that were offered were never just bare grain? Yeah.
Service.
Yeah. So there had to be a mental preparation for the idea of preparing that to be presented to God. Okay. We just celebrated Deb's mother's 90th birthday, and we had a tremendous time. And so Betty just is always giving of herself. And so she always had to think about the idea, they're going to have people over, going to be people around. I got to fix something, right? So she fixed these sour cream brownies. They are amazing. And the preparation that's there is a mindful thing that is there. Okay. So let me finish with this idea of the order of the sacrifices. And when we get into the book of Leviticus next week, I think that we need to understand, and I don't know why God did this, although it seems to be significant. I think it's very significant that he starts out with the most important sacrifice, and then he goes down from there. Not that any one of them is less important than the other, but we'll begin with the whole burnt offering. And the whole burnt offering is offered by individuals anytime. Okay? The next one is a meal offering. It's offered by individuals anytime. The next one is a peace offering. It's offered by a Jew that strayed, or then first offered the sin or the trespass offering to restore fellowship, and then offered a peace offering. The sin offering is given to restore fellowship with God. The trespass offering is to restore fellowship with a fellow Jew whom he had trespassed against and with God. And you're going to find out the significance is that if you trespass against a brother or sister, okay, Israelite, trespassed against a fellow Israelite, you also trespassed against God. There wasn't a separation. You can't make a separation of the idea of sinning or trespassing against a brother and not offending God. You do that, okay? That's one of the lessons that God had taught. So the trespass offering is to restore fellowship with a fellow Jew, but also to restore fellowship with God. And the Day of Atonement offered a one time each year by the high priest for the nation. So any thoughts or questions or observations? Yes.
If we do something and we violate the law, but if we do it in our mind and think it, then it's the same thing. I don't have to do it. I can look at someone and in my own mind do something that would be a violation and be that. And I can also, if I know a brother is going to do something and I wish evil upon him and not help, I'm doing it. It's violating, it's just as guilty as if I actually did it.
Yeah.
So we need to remember that and how we deal with our brothers and sisters and people in the world.
Yeah. You know, the interesting thing about the Sermon on the Mount and when Jesus came to the Sermon on the Mount, you know, he spoke those words as though Jews really should have known this before, right? But to them, it was a new teaching, and maybe it's because it was so distorted. Religion had so distorted things. Scribes and Pharisees, or the Pharisees, had distorted things. But Jesus reiterated actually what they should have known from the Old Testament, which is a reflection here of those things. And that's what Jerry's speaking about. Other thoughts? Yeah, Bill?
I noticed turtle doves.
Yes.
And some others. No mention of chickens. The animal that most people have the most of, the chicken was not mentioned. Was it not acceptable?
Well, I think the egg hadn't come yet. Which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? Yeah. So, I think that the only thing that I can answer to that, Bill, is that God designated what He wanted, right? And one of the things about the turtle doves was the idea that if they didn't have money for the poor who didn't have money, somehow or another they could buy a turtle dove. Now you remember what happened in the temple courts, and the reason why Jesus turned over the tables, right? The Pharisees were making money off the poor. God never intended that to happen. He allowed them to offer the poor. So rich or poor, they still were under the obligation to offer sacrifice. But God gave allowance for the poor with the idea of the turtle doves. Pigeons are turtle doves. Okay. Other thoughts?
He was really strict with his instructions of what to do. But it looks like he did the payroll, but he didn't mind about the first one.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, look what they did to Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus chapter 10. The passage speaks about the idea that they offered strange fire, and strange fire just means that it wasn't authorized. So they got fire from someplace else. I have my opinion about that, but they got fire from someplace else, but they used fire that God had not designated. And what did God do? He destroyed them. Fired them. What would happen if He had allowed them and never done anything?
Well, today,
Yeah,
basically.
other people would have seen the same thing and thought, well, I can do the same thing. Is that a picture of our religious world today? I can do whatever is right in my own eyes. That's not true. Okay? That is not true. Wasn't true in the Old Testament. It's not true in the New Testament. God has loved us so much that he's given us instruction about what to do. Okay? All right. We're going to close, prepare for worship here in just a little bit.